The vibration didn't start in the air. It started in the soles of my shoes, climbing up through 8 inches of cracked linoleum minutes before the first siren ever sounded. And I knew, the way you know your own pulse, that something was coming this hospital had no language for. Blood smells like copper and old pennies. The lavender sanitizer bolted to every wall in Riverside General smells like a lie someone tells in a clean room. And I had been telling myself that particular lie for 3 quiet years. They called me the float nurse, the quiet one, the woman who emptied bedpans and kept her eyes on the floor and said yes. Doctor to men half as competent as the corpsmen I used to bury. Then the rotors came in low over the ambulance bay, and grown Marines spilled through those automatic doors, shouting for someone called Sergeant Ma'am. Nobody in that building knew who they meant. I did. Let me tell you how we got there. My name is Dana Holt. For 3 years I have worked the overnight float shift at Riverside General, 60 beds wedged between a state highway and a soybean field. 40 minutes from the back gate of a Marine base most of the staff had never bothered to learn the name of. Float means no department claims you. It means they send you wherever the holes open up. Med-Surg at midnight, the ER at 2, Psych at 4 when somebody calls in and nobody wants to say why. It is, by design, the most invisible job a hospital can offer a person, and I chose it the way you choose anything you are trying to disappear inside of. The hospital has its own weather. The fluorescent lights don't buzz, not exactly. They hum, a low abrasive frequency that burrows in behind your eyes by hour 10 of a 12-hour shift. The coffee in the break room tastes like used motor oil, and somebody refills it out of guilt around 3 in the morning. Clogs on linoleum sound like a gavel coming down, over and over, judgment on nothing in particular. The overhead lamps in the trauma bay throw a sickly, sterile glow that makes everyone's skin look like something already dying. To the civilian staff, a busy night in that ER is a war zone. To me, it has always been a waiting room. I move through all of it with an economy nobody notices, because nobody is looking, and that has always been the point. I catalog the exits in every room I enter without ever deciding to. I find a thready vein by feel before the resident finds it by sight. My pulse does not climb when the monitor starts screaming, and at least twice a shift somebody asks if I'm even paying attention. I am. I am always paying attention. That part I have never explained to anyone in this building, and nobody has ever cared enough to ask twice. There is a tell I have never managed to train out of myself, and it isn't subtle if you know what you're looking for. Though nobody in 3 years ever has. My left knee aches before storms roll in. An old souvenir from a fast rope exercise that went wrong before any of this started, and on those nights I favor it just slightly, just enough that I catch my own gait the way I used to catch everyone else's. I never complain about it. Complaining requires an audience, and I have spent 3 years making sure I don't have one. I work the rounds nobody fights over. The 4 a.m. vitals check, the linen change at shift's end, the slow circuit through every bay just to confirm with my own eyes that nothing has quietly gone wrong while the charting caught up. Most nurses treat the circuit as a chore. I treat it the way I used to treat a perimeter sweep. Methodical, unhurried, complete. And if anyone had ever asked why a float nurse walked the floor like she was checking sectors instead of rooms, I would not have had an easy answer ready. Dr. Aaron Pruitt ran the night shift like a man who had never once been told no and had decided, somewhere around his 3rd year of residency, that he never would be again. He entered a room already mid-command, white coat snapping like he'd ordered it to. 3 weeks ago, an elderly patient's oxygen saturation started dropping mid-transfer, and I caught it before the monitor did, by the color under his fingernails, by the shallow rasp under his collarbone. I said so, quietly, at the foot of the bed. Pruitt didn't look at the chart. He didn't look at the patient either. "I didn't ask the bedpan girl for a diagnosis," he said, loud enough to carry clean across the bay, loud enough that I understood he wanted every nurse and tech within range to hear it land. "Get back to your cart." I didn't argue. You don't argue with a man who needs an audience to feel correct. I set the chart down. 30 seconds later, the patient's oxygen saturation dropped exactly where I'd said it would, and Pruitt called the rapid response himself and let the room believe he'd caught it. I walked back to my cart and restocked gauze that didn't need restocking. My hands didn't shake. They never do. I have given myself full permission to be invisible in this building. I have never given myself permission to be wrong. Pruitt had no idea what he'd just dismissed. He had no idea that the woman he'd called the bedpan girl had once made decisions in the dirt, under fire, that decided who in her unit got to keep breathing and who didn't. That the quiet float nurse he'd just humiliated in front of a full bay had once been trusted with things this hospital didn't have a department for. He saw tired eyes and a soft voice. He had no framework for the rest of it. And that gap between what he believed and what was actually standing in front of him was closing faster than he could have prepared for. In the supply corridor, alone, I let myself have 30 seconds, which is the most I ever allow. I keep a folding multi-tool in my scrub pocket that has no business in a hospital and every business in Sangin, Helmand Province, where I carried it through a deployment I still don't talk about and have never fully put down. I took this job because invisible people don't get asked questions they can't answer cleanly. I took the float shift specifically because nobody builds an attachment to someone who is never in the same room twice. It is not a failure of nerve. It is a strategy, and on most days, it is the correct one. I made that choice in a dirt floor aid station a long time ago, and I respected it enough to keep making it. Every shift, every cart, every silence, right up until the night it stopped being enough. Service doesn't end just because the orders do. Nobody tells you that before you take the uniform off, that the instinct to step toward the wound instead of away from it doesn't get discharged along with everything else on your paperwork. I traded the daily version of it for something smaller and quieter, emptying bedpans, restocking carts, watching Walt Drummond's vitals from across a room, because nobody else was watching closely enough to notice when they slipped. It isn't the same kind of duty. It is still duty. I never once told myself otherwise, not even on the nights it felt like the smallest version of myself I could possibly be. Bed 11 held Walt Drummond, 71, a Gulf War veteran in for chest pain that Pruitt had already decided, without examining him properly, was anxiety. I'd brought Walt a second blanket 20 minutes earlier because his hands were cold and nobody else had noticed, and he'd looked at me with the particular recognition some veterans carry like a second language, and said, "You've done this before, haven't you?" I hadn't answered. He hadn't pushed. He just nodded once, the way men who've earned the right to wait quietly do, and let me tuck the blanket around his shoulders without making it a thing. Pruitt came back through 40 minutes later and told Walt, in front of half the bay, that he was wasting a bed real emergencies might need. I read Walt's vitals from across the room and knew Pruitt was wrong. I could have ended that conversation in 4 words: my rank, my province, my unit. I chose silence instead, the way I always chose silence, and somewhere in the back of my skull a voice that sounded exactly like my old gunnery sergeant said, "That's going to cost somebody." I didn't know yet how right he was. Something was already moving toward us that nobody in that building could hear yet. And in less than 40 minutes it was going to come through those doors and make every person in that ER reconsider everything they thought they understood about the quiet float nurse. The vibration found me again before the first scream did. Heavy, rhythmic. 3 blades cutting air in a pattern no civilian medevac chopper makes. An MV-22 Osprey transitioning out of forward flight into a hover. The kind of sound that registers first in your back molars and only later in your ears. I knew the cadence before I could see it through the ambulance bay glass. Not my problem, I told myself, and shoved my hands into my pockets and pressed my spine flat against the corridor wall. Because that is what you do when you have decided, on purpose, to be done being that person. Then the doors blew open, and chaos arrived, wearing a litter team. The patient was a Marine corporal, maybe 22 years old, with a sucking chest wound and a trachea visibly shifting under the skin of his throat. A tension pneumothorax, the kind that kills in single-digit minutes, the kind that needs a needle in a precise location before it needs anything a civilian trauma bay usually has time to locate. Pruitt called for imaging. Imaging would take 11 minutes. The corporal had maybe 4. The charge nurse was hyperventilating into her own collar. A resident stood frozen with a clipboard in his hand, like it might somehow intervene on its own. Walt Drummond, 2 beds over, had gone completely silent, watching. The way men who have already seen this exact kind of dying tend to go quiet. Somewhere behind me a tech was calling for a crash cart that wouldn't fix what was actually killing this kid, and a nurse I didn't recognize was crying without seeming to realize it. And none of it was really anyone's fault. Civilian trauma bays are built to protect against the injuries civilians get. Car wrecks, falls, the occasional gunshot, not the specific, catastrophic physics of a blast injury sustained 40 minutes from a training range. Pruitt had never seen a tension pneumothorax move this fast. I had. I had seen it move faster, in worse light, with men shouting things in 2 languages at once, and some buried, disciplined part of me was already counting seconds before I gave myself permission to do anything about it. Pruitt was sweating through his collar, shouting orders that didn't match the injury in front of him, and for the first time since I had walked into that building 3 years ago, my hands started to shake. I started toward the bed, and Pruitt saw me coming and barked at security to walk me out. Said, loud enough for the entire bay, that I had no business near a trauma like this. A guard's hand closed around my arm and steered me into the corridor, and the automatic doors sealed shut between me and the sound of a young man drowning, slowly and audibly, in his own chest. I stood there. I listened. The monitor alarm on the other side of the door changed pitch, climbing, frantic. The specific tone that means seconds, not minutes. I made a decision in under 4 seconds. The kind of decision I used to make for a living. Then I moved. The floor shook again before the second team hit the doors. Harder this time. Boots instead of rotors. Through the ambulance bay glass, I watched 8 Marines clear the parking lot in a loose tactical wedge. Nothing like the shuffling rush of civilian M's. Eyes moving room to room before feet committed to a direction. They didn't wait for the automatic doors to finish opening. A gunnery sergeant came through first, blood on his sleeve that wasn't his. He didn't ask permission, and he didn't acknowledge Pruitt's badge or his title. "Where's your trauma bay?" the gunny said, flat, already moving. And when Pruitt started in with something about protocol and liability, the gunny cut him off in 1 sentence without breaking stride. "Sir, step back." He didn't look at Pruitt again. "Who is she?" a younger Marine behind him said, scanning the corridor like the answer might be written on a wall. Nobody in that hallway knew who he meant. Staff started looking around at each other, searching for someone, anyone, who might fit whatever they were asking for. Then the gunny turned, scanned the corridor himself, and said it. 1 word. Not a question. confirmation he was already certain of. The hallway had gone strange and quiet under all that fluorescent hum, the kind of quiet that makes a single syllable carry the length of an entire corridor. "Sergeant, ma'am." Nobody moved, because nobody else in that hallway knew who he meant. I was the only person who didn't look around for an answer. I was looking at the floor, at my own hands, at the section of wall where my shoulder blades had been pressed for the last 4 minutes. That stillness, the one person not searching, was how he found me. He looked directly at me. I looked back. I pushed off the wall. I didn't run. I walked, and somewhere between the wall and the gunny my spine straightened in a way it hadn't in 3 years. And for the first time since I had taken this job, I felt aligned instead of folded small. The fluorescent hum that had lived behind my eyes for 3 straight years went quiet somewhere in those 10 steps, replaced by something older, a rotor count. A corpsman's voice, a rhythm I had never actually managed to leave behind no matter how hard I'd tried. "I'm not Sergeant Ma'am anymore," I said to no one and everyone at once, "but I still know how to do this." My voice didn't rise. It changed texture instead, went flat, cold, precise, the way a scalpel is precise. I looked at the security guard who still had a hand on my arm. "Let go." One word. He let go. I crossed that bay in 5 steps and was inside the corporal's chest before my brain finished catching up with my hands. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line, right side. I found the landmark by feel. The way I'd found it before in places with worse lighting, no monitor, and nothing in my ear but a corpsman's voice telling me to go faster. 14-gauge needle. A rush of trapped air hissed out from under my fingers, and the corporal's collapsed lung found room to move again, and the number on the monitor began climbing back into a range that meant a person was going to live. I called for a 14 French chest tube and didn't wait to see if anyone moved before reaching for it myself. Because waiting costs lives, and I had spent 2 tours learning exactly how much. I made the incision at the 5th intercostal space, anterior to the mid-axillary line, the same way I had been trained to do it on a stretcher in the back of a moving vehicle with somebody's shaking hands holding a flashlight instead of a proper lamp. This bay had a proper lamp. It felt almost unfair how much easier this was than the version I had trained for. My hands did not shake. They had not shaken since the second I touched him. Pruitt was somewhere behind me, sputtering something about liability that nobody in that room had bandwidth left to hear. The charge nurse had stopped hyperventilating and started handing me supplies before I asked for them, because the room had reorganized itself, fast, around competence instead of rank. The gunny didn't give me a single order after that moment. He started taking mine, somewhere in the part of my brain that still belonged to a province most of these Marines had only heard about secondhand. I heard the voice of the corpsman who'd gone down in the first 5 minutes of the worst night of my deployment and left me holding a job nobody had trained me for, the count he'd drilled into me before he ever needed me to use it without him. 2 seconds to find it, 1 to commit. I used his count, the same way I have always used his count, because some things you do not leave behind even when you leave everything else. I placed the chest tube clean. The bleeding slowed. The corporal's eyes opened, found my face, and he managed 1 word before the sedation pulled him fully under. "Ma'am." The gunny looked at the monitor, then at me, and said it quietly, just for the room. She moved the way people move when the stakes are real. It was a captain who said the rest 20 minutes later, reading off a tablet, because some things don't get spoken from memory, they get read aloud, so nobody in the room can argue with them afterward. Sergeant Dana Holt, United States Marine Corps, 2 tours. A platoon's emergency medic, after their corpsman went down and command structure, had no time to pause for paperwork in the middle of a firefight. Sangin and a second province nobody in that hallway needed named out loud. 7 men kept breathing under mortar fire on a single night in 2019 that half her old platoon still calls the worst night of their lives. And the reason? Every one of them will tell you that they lived to complain about it. A unit citation for courage under fire. A name some of the younger Marines in that hallway had heard whispered like a rumor before they ever set foot in this hospital. Sergeant Ma'am, the medic, who never lost a single man she got her hands on in time. The one their brothers still talked about like a story too good to be entirely true. The captain didn't editorialize. He didn't need to. He read the citation language exactly as it was written, distinguished herself by exceptional courage, composure, and devotion to duty, actions reflecting the highest credit upon herself and the naval service, and let 4 years of silence answer questions nobody in that hospital had known to ask. I hadn't worn that citation anywhere but a drawer in my apartment in 4 years. I hadn't needed to. The people who deserved to know what it cost already knew, and the people who didn't were never owed an explanation in the first place. Pruitt's face did something I won't call shame, because I'm not certain he has the vocabulary for it. It simply emptied. The practiced authority he'd worn all night didn't survive contact with a record he couldn't argue with. His jaw stayed set, but something behind his eyes had stopped working. The way a man looks when the room he thought he was in charge of turns out to have been someone else's the entire time. Whatever expression he had been wearing, built entirely on the assumption that the float nurse was beneath his attention, had nowhere left to live. Then, the salute happened, the way it always happens. Without ceremony, 6 Marines, gear shifting, the dull clink of kit settling as 8 hands snapped up at once. The kind of respect that doesn't need an audience to mean something. I returned it. The charge nurse had a hand pressed over her mouth. Walt Drummond, from his bed 2 rows over, was the only person in that room who didn't look surprised. He just nodded once, like a man confirming something he'd already suspected, and went back to watching, quietly, the way men who have earned that right tend to. Walt caught my eye once more before they wheeled him off toward the workup Pruitt should have ordered an hour earlier. He didn't say much. Veterans rarely do, when it actually counts. "Proud of you, Sergeant," he said, and went quiet again, and it was the only sentence all night that actually needed saying. I didn't give a speech. I didn't look at Pruitt again. There was nothing left to say to him that the room hadn't already said for me, more completely than I ever could have. I helped the team stabilize the corporal for transport, and when the Osprey lifted off the helipad 20 minutes later, I went back to the supply closet and finished restocking the cart I had abandoned an hour earlier. Because the cart did not care what had just happened, and on most nights, neither do I, not in the way that matters. I am still the float nurse. I will be the float nurse again tomorrow night, and the night after that, and I have made my peace with that. The same considered peace I made a long time ago in a province far from this one. I opened the bottom drawer and counted the masks back into neat stacks of 10. Still here, still whole. If Sergeant Holt's story stayed with you, hit that like button and share it with someone who's been underestimated and never said a word about it. Subscribe to this channel. We tell the stories of quiet people who carried more than anyone around them ever knew, and never once asked to be recognized for it. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this one travels.